All right, here we are with another lecture in History 1301, and this lecture is going to cover the life and times of Benjamin Franklin and the Great Awakening. So when we talked last time, we discussed in rather great detail about the Enlightenment and its impact upon, well, American history, European history, and just simply world history. The Enlightenment is obviously a very much a scientific and reason-based movement. But one of the things I may not have brought out clearly to you, but I want to say explicitly now to you, is that if you think about what the Enlightenment teaches and how to go about assuring yourself of authority and knowing what is true and is not, it puts a very heavy emphasis on the material, the physical. One man I did not mention, but was himself a child of the Enlightenment and one of the larger voices in the Enlightenment, an Englishman, is named John Locke, Locke. And we think of John Locke on the political side, which is of course appropriate, but at the same time he was a scientific thinker in addition to being a political thinker. And in the late 1680s or so, he is going to posit the theory that the human brain is a passive receiver. That's something akin to like the old the dry erase chalkboard sort of idea, that you can write onto it whatever you want and it just receives and makes note of it. But if you look at the larger Enlightenment ideas and pushes and developments, you come to understand that the Enlightenment is largely thought of as a materialistic order, not metaphysical, not spiritual, in the sense that there is this higher idea. Even the deism that is spawned by the Enlightenment is that of a transcendent God, but he is a detached God. And all he did was he created the material order, the physical order that we see here and we feel and see, and it is all we know. So you really see a heavy emphasis on the material and a downplaying of the spiritual, and even in religious circles that is certainly true. One of the individuals who is also a figure of the Enlightenment, and but will also be very friendly with those who are less convinced by the Enlightenment arguments, is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin might be the first American. One book from about 20 or 25 years ago, a biography of Franklin, goes on to call him exactly that, the first American. He is, in many respects, the first American to be a celebrity that is known in Europe. Benjamin Franklin, of course, is a founding father, and he has a lot of different interests. But born in 1706, Benjamin Franklin is born in Boston, but he spends most of his adulthood, or at least a good portion of his adulthood, in somewhere other than Boston. He spends a portion of it, about 20 years or so, in Philadelphia, and then he spends about another 20 years in Europe, mostly London. And he is buried in Boston. He is born in Boston, but most of his life is spent outside of Boston. And so we pick up with Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin is really, in a sense, maybe the chief example of the Enlightenment in the American colonies. Well, part of the reason you could say that about him is that he's also, in a sense, maybe an example of the American dream. And if that's what is the American dream, it's the idea, I've always defined it as this, is that you can come from nothing and become whatever your abilities and a little bit of luck or providence would shine upon you, and go far. And frankly, with Franklin, he is going to come from not abject poverty, but a large family of about 15 siblings. And he goes from relative obscurity and I won't say grinding poverty, but he's certainly not wealthy, but then goes on and becomes himself a very wealthy man. And he retires at about the age of 40, which is quite impressive. And then he becomes the Dr. Franklin. But he's also Franklin is a person who is a child of the Enlightenment, in that he is going to emphasize science, and you find him doing tinkerings and experiments and so forth. And in a sense also he's a Renaissance man, because you find his interest very varied. In that sense, he's like Cotton Mather. In that sense, he's like Thomas Jefferson. Two very different individuals of our previous lecture, but yet here they are being brought into the equation and being examples of the Enlightenment thinking. But Franklin himself is going to grow up, he's going to run away from home. He becomes a printer, and being a printer is a good way to build muscles. Being a college professor, not so much. Going to the gym, good way to build muscles. Working and carrying railroad ties, builds muscles. Working outside or doing heavy and hard labor, which can be good for a youth, but grinding and breaking for an older or middle-aged man. Franklin is going to work in a printer shop, his brother James's printer shop. The thing is that Franklin develops and learns how to print and to get into the newspaper business, the pamphlet business, the almanac business, and he's good at it. He turns out to be very, very good at it. And so Franklin is a strapping physical character just simply because of what he does. You do repetitive, heavy lifting and moving and building. It tends to build your torso up. It builds your strength in your legs and back and so forth, and his arms. I don't want to make it look like he was in the gym the guys who are in the gym all the time that have, six-pack abs and, big old muscles on top of muscles, and, they're going to go, let me show you the way, and he pulls back his arm, and, my shoulder just hurt when I did that. But anyways, the thing is he's not going to do that. But Franklin was a physical specimen for a time when elites did not, especially as he got older, a time when elites, for them, physical exertion meant getting in a cab or a carriage and going places. He loved to horseback. He loved to swim. He loved to be active, and that reflected his early days. So anyways, with regard to Franklin, he gets into the trades, and he gets into the newspaper and the printing trade, and that's a very lucrative business for him. When he's in Philadelphia, and after he'd really left the auspices of his brother, Franklin, when he's about 18 years old, will travel to Europe for the first time to do business for some Philadelphia merchants. Ends up being a relatively disastrous idea. I say disastrous, it isn't like he's nearly killed or anything, but it certainly doesn't go like it was supposed to. Franklin is over there in about 1726 or so, and what he finds in London is fascinating on the one hand and absolutely dirty on the other. So Franklin, the great intellectual, Franklin, the burgeoning American, finds himself in London, and he runs out of money, has to work a little bit, but he lives for about 18 months, maybe about 16 months in London. And while in London, he is able to behold a great city. London in the early 1700s is growing, and it's growing rapidly. London in the 1700s is reflecting the growing and the rapidly rising British Empire. So I guess those notes need to go in, those words need to go in your notes now, the British Empire. In the early 1700s, England is no longer a backwater. England is also now welded securely to Ireland and to Scotland and to Wales. And so the United Kingdom, Great Britain, is now born. And so the British Empire in the early 1700s is going to start to spread itself out, which ultimately, before it's all said and done, the British Empire will control vast amounts of territory. North America, with the colonies that we're concerned with. Canada, of course, eventually as well. India and Australia, just to name a few. And then there's colonies in Africa. And so when it is said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, that too, like the Spanish before it, was a true statement. But London was a foul and nasty city. And what had happened with London was that it was drawing people to it. And this story is in a sense as old as man himself, but certainly it's a story of modernity. In this, when I say modernity, I say the last 400 or 500 years, you will see lots and lots of individuals moving off of the farm and moving into the city. Certainly in the Enlightenment period, and if not a little bit before, the city drew people. Now we say London, and that's where we're focused on, but it's true for some of you watching this. Going to a city and living in a city and experiencing a city is really what you hope to do in life. You may think that Bryan College Station, compared to where you come from, is a large town and a burgeoning city, but the vast majority of you, honestly watching this, probably come from a major metropolitan area. But for the few of you who come from a small town, the last thing you may want to do, and some of you might disagree, but many of you probably who come from a smallish town, the last thing you want to do is to go back to that small town because there seems to be no future there. The people who are left behind are the second-rate individuals, and I'm not trying to pick on your family or anything like that, but the best and the brightest of the community, the best and the brightest of the young men, they don't stay in Two Forks in the Road, Texas. They move on, and they go to Dallas, or they move to Houston, especially, say, if you're going into civil engineering or construction or something like that. Can you make money building stuff in small-town Texas, say in West Texas around Abilene, at Rising Star, Comanche, or out around Langtree and Del Rio? Probably not. And so you move to where the business is. There, you move even when you're in your 20s or so where there is excitement. You go to a city so you can get into trouble. You can sow some wild oats and so forth. And in a sense, that's what you get with Benjamin Franklin. The man sowed wild oats. He's a young man. He's not married or anything at this point in time. And so he sows wild oats, and he himself said he probably should have died from, or at least should have contracted some sort of venereal disease. But he did not. He did not contract any sort of thing like that, but he did sow wild oats with some reckless abandon. And while he was in London, he also would have seen the filth of London as well, which was, because it's a growing city, haphazardly at times, organized at others, but it was a growing city that was drawing all those country boys and those country girls too, for that matter, into town, into the city, and blowing it up to the size of 500,000 or pushing 1 million individuals. Point is this: London is a big city, and with big cities come big problems. Especially in the early days. And remember this, they don't know, as I said in the last lecture, they don't know modern medicine. They don't know germ theory. As has been said before, one of the things that helps set modernity apart and helps us get healthier is when we figure out how to handle and to drink clean water and how to handle and to dispose of wastewater. You don't want them commingling because for obvious reasons, as we know now, that can make you very sick. But in the 1700s, when Franklin would have been in London the first time, or later on in Paris when he's a diplomat for the American Revolution, or London later when he's an adult, going and living in London could be very bad for your health, especially if you're drinking water from a shallow well. The good water is generally at the hundreds of feet, not at the tens of feet. But drinking water from a shallow well has been shown over the years in many cities, including London, to be a main conveyor of things like cholera and other waterborne ailments. And so you will see fouled water and these tight and grotesque living arrangements. The city itself stunk. Every city in antiquity and every city up until the present time, arguably, and it depends on the city, of course, but every city, especially prior to the modern era of, say, the 1800s, late 1800s at least, stunk. You'll see people such as H.L. Mencken, who grew up in Baltimore in the late 19th century, and so this would be like 1890s. He said, "My city in the summer smelt like 1 billion dead polecats." And you'll see comments along those lines here, there, and everywhere, and London was no different. So living in London or going to a major city was an assault upon the nostrils. It was also potentially an assault upon not just the health, your immune system, but it was also an assault upon your eyes. And so one of the things that, like I said, drew those kids in was promises of jobs, a better life, new adventures, fun, beating the drudgery of the small town and the farm. And so urbanization is taking place, and it's going to be a story that continues to the present time. However, moving to the city was easier said for a boy than it was for a woman or a girl. The thing about a boy moving to a city, the thing was he could, with willing hands and a strong back, he could find regular work. I'm not saying he's going to be making money hand over fist, but at the same time, he could find work. It was less true of a woman. And so for her options are much more limited to what can she do and what options does she have. She may have had a little money when she came to town. She may have had very little money when she came to London. And one of the things you saw is that these girls, these younger girls, when I say young, 18-ish territory, they move to these cities and they get into town. They run out of money or beat out of their money, or when I say beat out of it, meaning like in a game or something, they lose it there, or they're literally robbed or something of that nature. So you have to make money. You have to figure out how to survive. You got to eat. So what do? There's no, to speak of, there's no social safety net put on by the crown or the government, so that's out of the question. If you were a guy, one of the things you could have done was you could, if you really wanted to, have joined the Navy or joined the Army as an enlisted man. That's certainly an option, but you can't do that as a woman. And so one of the things is that you'll find a lot of these country girls who go to the town, these country girls who go to the city, when they run out of money, they turn to prostitution. And that's despite sometimes rosy colors that you get from movies over the years, or the rosy colors of the rose-colored glasses, as it were, of prostitutes. The pejorative phrase is the hooker with a heart of gold sort of thing. I mean, I can't say it never happens, but that's not really the case. I mean, bluntly put, the sex trade is a very bad one. It's very harsh. It's unforgiving. It's hellish. And so for these girls here, if they entered into prostitution, all the attendant problems that you could imagine are going to be visited upon them. And so obviously one of the problems with prostitution is the issue of venereal disease. These girls are going to, because of what they do and the lack of, I say lack of, mean like they could have, but prophylactics really don't work at that time period. Birth control does not work, no modern medicine. So it was a matter of time, frankly, before a prostitute contracted a venereal disease. It just was. And so when they did, that is going to cause problems. It degrades their ability to make money. It degrades their ability to charge, all those sorts of things there. And it's just a cycle begetting cycle. And so becoming a prostitute is really a guarantee for most of these women, a guarantee of a short life and a horrible life. And if you do not know what, especially say a syphilis, I referenced that a minute ago, or certainly in the last lecture about treating people for syphilis. If you do not know what syphilis does, it's really a wicked sexually transmitted disease. In that, what it does is amongst other things, it will eat out your brain. One of the famous men in American history who had syphilis and was essentially an incoherent man late in life because of it, because it could not be treated at that point, was Al Capone. He had it, and it ruined his mind to the point where he had to be walked around by the hand. In addition to having syphilis also had the ability to disfigure you, and to the point where, say, another famous figure out of history, Rasputin, who himself had syphilis, but because he's Rasputin and there was something, he was a strange, and I'll say it like this: he was a strange and odd man in a strange and odd metaphysical sort of way. But anyways, he gave syphilis to this one woman, and she saw him and found him years later, and he didn't recognize her because she was so deformed by the syphilis physically. She was unrecognizable to Rasputin, and I think she shot him or something like that. Of course, didn't kill him. But all of which is to say is that when we talk about syphilis, it's a horrible disease to have, let alone the many, many, many other sexually transmitted diseases that are out there. So these women, these girls, are going to have short lives, hard lives, and frankly, bad lives for a few years, and then dead by 30, dead by 40, sort of thing. So their life expectancy is very short. But obviously, one of the second major problem with to the woman, to the prostitute, with being a prostitute in London, for example, in the 1700s when Benjamin Franklin would have been there, is that of pregnancy. Again, birth control non-existent, prophylactics non-existent, et cetera, and so forth. And so you really, the problem now is you got pregnancy to these prostitutes, and what do you do with the babies? Ideally, you would think that there would be some sort of outreach and help, and that the woman would sacrifice her life for the child, et cetera, and so on. But human reality is a lot different, frankly. And what ends up happening is that in London, and this is stuff that Franklin would have seen at times, you would have seen children literally laying on the street. And everyone understood where those children came from. They were children born to prostitutes, and hopefully somebody will take that baby into their arms, and like adopting a stray animal today, like a stray dog or a stray cat, they would adopt that child, and some certainly did. But it's estimated before the great orphanage system of England gets underway, the great orphanage system of Great Britain is established. It is estimated that the infant mortality rate of these children in this time period, say in around the year 1700, 1720, when Franklin would have been there, before the orphanages get underway, the infant mortality rate is about 99%. What that means is that basically all these children, these little babies, these infants perish before the first year of life. It is horrible stuff. It's not, and they're not just left on the street corner. Some of them will be put under piers. Others will literally be drowned. And it's a grisly and ghoulish stuff that's going on in this modernizing England that was not nearly as common 100 to 150 years before 1700. Not to say that there hasn't been prostitution or anything like that. I'm just saying is that these women coming to town, it just exacerbates the problem as the city grows. Like I said, it's a foul place to be. The Thames River, which is the main water artery running through the heart of London. If you've ever been to London, you have probably crossed the Thames River on the Tower Bridge or some other waterway or something of that nature. The Thames River stinks. And one of the first things Franklin does as he is in town is he wants to go and swim in and drink from the Thames River because he'd always read about it. He'd always heard about it. Franklin, in many respects, is like the Enlightenment in that he is a self-taught man. Now, obviously, there are people who are in the Enlightenment who are taught by teachers and professors and such, but Franklin is a self-taught man. He is self-educated, so that's an aspect. So he wanted to drink from that Thames River, which, by the way, also acted as the public drain pipe or the public sewer. So that's why it burned the nostrils. It stings the nostrils. It is horrible to be in, and to drink it is perhaps just about as dangerous and deadly as going to prostitutes in this same era. It's all bad. I say it's all bad, but eventually what you do see, to be clear, is that you see the development in London of some basic, primitive, but basic city ordinances and stuff to try to rein in this filth, or at least keep it bottled up. And secondly, you're going to see the development of the orphanage system to save those children. You claim yourself to be a Christian nation, you suffer the children to come unto me. That's one of Jesus' dictums in the directives in the Bible to his disciples. You've got an obligation as a Christian to protect children and to help them, I would argue. And certainly it became a scandal, a national scandal, and that brought on the orphanage system. But, when you do something, in this case here, you save the children. You also are going to cause potentially, in a sense, another problem. And I don't mean this, it's one of the byproducts of doing good, is that sometimes now you've saved the children, now they become adults. Now what do you do with those boys and girls that you saved? And so you see in many respects the beginnings of the au pair and the, not beginnings, but you see the flourishing and the spreading of the housekeeping system that you see in London and other elite cities, London and other major cities. But for the boys, what do? You send them to the Navy. And so when you talk about the British Empire, you can talk about the financial structure of the British Empire, which is important, but I'm not going to go into that because I just want to keep moving. But I will say this because I'm kind of setting my pawns out now a little bit for the coming of the American Revolution, is that the British have the ability to, one, raise a lot of money, but secondly, they also, as the empire builds and is really coming into adolescence and later into maturity, the British Empire is going to develop the best navy on the planet. You get to the year 1800, and certainly by 1900, the British Navy is the most excellent navy in all of the world, with only occasional hiccups to that dominance. It is a blue water navy. It is a protective navy. It is an attacking navy. It is a great navy, and it is really one of the hallmarks of Great Britain and the empire itself. And so, in fact, actually, you'll see a lot of these boys who are born to prostitutes and then given up for adoption find a home not in somebody else's house, but in the house, or rather on the high seas. And you'll see them traveling about, being the backbone, as it were, the enlisted backbone of the Navy, and they make a career out of it. And so what they do, as the Navy expands and becomes so prominent, it spawns a song. And it's really one of the more famous songs that I would say that some Americans have heard before. Maybe it's not as prominent or common as I used to think, but if you've ever seen the old movie, it's about a 30, 40-year-old movie at this point called National Lampoon's European Vacation. It's played several times when Chevy Chase and his family are traveling around Big Ben there in London. And they basically, it goes like this. The song goes, or the tune goes, dun, 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 and then it rolls on and flourishes out. you've all probably have heard it before. In that, I mean, when it opens up, I mean, it just sounds like we are British and we are here and you better pay attention to us. And it's not one of those, oh, you need to pay attention to me sorts of whines from a child. But it's a declarative opening of the British Empire and a declarative opening of British hegemony in Europe, or at least dominance in Europe, in the sense that we are Britain. And we are on the waves. And by the way, it's called Rule. The song is called Rule Britannia. Rule Britannia. There is no, well, there might be other nations that are just as good as we are. There's no hand-wringing in that song. It's really a prideful song, and it's really the English at the core of the whole thing, but there's a pridefulness of being English, British, etc. And it goes like this. Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britons, Britons, Britons never will be slaves. And it goes on and sings from there. It is a very proud, it's a proud anthem. That in an empire or a country, as it's really feeling its way, it just kind of goes, and perhaps arguably it's like My Country 'Tis of Thee, America the Beautiful. You see it from an American perspective, that today may just, if you were to try to sing America the Beautiful or My Country 'Tis of Thee, in certain circles in American cities, it would hit an off chord because a lot of folks may not feel that way about the nation anymore. Some of you are like, not me, not my circle. I like to hear that song. I know. But at the same time, not every American would say that. But at times gone by, is my point, many Americans would have no problem, regardless of their background. No Americans would have any problem, or very few would have any problem with singing America the Beautiful or something like that. Same idea here with Rule Britannia. It is a proud time to be a Briton. And I would say this to your notes as well, and because I just said a minute ago, I'm going to start laying out my pawns. I am laying out my pawns with the coming of the American Revolution. But in 1720, Americans, generally speaking, would not have thought of themselves as an American so much, but they would have thought of themselves first as a Briton, thought of themselves first as an Englishman. Yes, they may have been descendants of malcontents, cranks, and kooks, and the English, were all happy to dump them in North America as cheaply as possible. But the thing is now, they're no longer poor. Americans are doing well. Later on, of course, Franklin is an example of that. And they're proud to be Britain. They're proud to be British. Things can change. It just does like anything in life. It changes. And so, a lot of Americans would have, puffed out their chest in pride a little bit with Rule Britannia. It's nice to be a part of the empire because you get a special perch. We had a special perch in the empire. Of course, it goes away with the Revolution, but that's certainly all there. So anyways, Franklin is in Europe. Franklin is in London. He sees the circus, as it were, impressed by it because he goes back and spends another 20 years later on in life and effectively abandons his wife in the process. But anyways, all of which is to say is that Franklin is gone, comes back to Philadelphia after spending some time in England, and then begins to proceed to assemble in his 20s and 30s his great empire, his great wealth, frankly. And you find him everywhere. You find him putting his fingers in the pies of this and that. Obviously, the trades of writing and printing, that's what he makes money off of. It's not just selling almanacs to the farmer, like Poor Richard's Almanac. He makes money that way. But one of the other ways, and it's always been true for this, is that if you can get a government contract, whether it's in a modern sense to build guns or weapons for the Defense Department, or a government contract to provide meals for the disaster relief, or whatever it is, but if you can get a government contract, in this case printing broadleafs and important papers, you can make some money at it. And so Franklin, he dipped into the public treasury. And I don't mean that in a dastardly sort of way. I don't at all. But he certainly did all right. And he made a lot of good money at it, and he became a wealthy man. You also find Franklin himself you find him messing around in philosophical clubs, the Essex Junto of Philadelphia. It was an essay club that argued every so often. There would be papers presented, very enlightenment in the way they think and act. Papers presented on religion or history or politics or natural sciences. You get that flavor in the 1700s of the Enlightenment, of things that may have been uninteresting or unavailable in the 1600s are now up for debate and discussion. And I don't mean like a bad way, but just you can discuss things. Franklin was also a major proponent of the library. You find the Philadelphia Public Library being started and endowed partially by Franklin. There were many men who come together to get this, but the understanding is that reading was good. Reading was good for a society. Reading was good for the local community. And that if you can't afford an army of books, like if you can see behind me, I've got more books than I probably need. I sound like a Quaker when I say that, but you have all these books here. The fact of the matter is that maybe all those books could be gotten from a library one way or the other. The thing is that they're all available and easily gotten, and you can help the poor man out to educate himself. Even if he can't read well, he can read something. And so that too is this self-help and self-improvement is an idea of the Enlightenment in a form or fashion. Let's see, you've got the American Philosophical Society, which is similar to the Junto. Franklin is also going to be a part of the Fire Brigade and the helping to build a Philadelphia, which is also a Quakerish idea as well. Philadelphia, where Franklin is living in the mid-1700s, build a Philadelphia that is resistant to fire, meaning it's not on top of each other, so fires just jump from building to building and burn the city down. That's mostly made of wood. So anyways, all that to say is that Franklin, you find his fingerprints everywhere, beyond just making of money and worrying about only the printing of documents, which, by the way, he sometimes wrote under his own name, and so a lot of times he wrote under a nom de plume, basically a pen name, Silence Dogood. He did this as a young man, and he did this as an adult. So Franklin is everywhere. But Franklin's biography he's just personally one of those interesting characters that you'd like to get your hands on. I mean, if you were to ask me who would be, one of the, dozen or so historical figures that I wouldn't mind having at my dinner table if I could bring them back from the dead, as it were, and have them have supper with me and just tell stories and talk to, Franklin, I think, would be one of the people I would love to have dinner with. By the way, Franklin is a bit of a hypocrite. He's kind of a funny character in that sense. He could talk about being frugal and this and that, yet he could spend money with the best of them. And at the same time, too, he and some of the other founding fathers, John Adams, for example, do not get along very well. And famously, Adams and Franklin at times hated each other. I think, Adams referred to him as that old conjurer. And Adams did not mean that as a compliment. If for some reason you thought that all the founding fathers all just worked along marvelously together and worked for the good of the country and, just held hands and sang Kumbaya and beat the British, that's a bunch of garbage. It's not always the feuding of a bunch of cats, but it is hurting a bunch of cats, and especially it gets worse after the revolution is over. That's not to say that but they didn't always get along, is my point. But Franklin had some eccentricities about him. Obviously, he loved to swim. Swimming in the Thames River is about like that old Seinfeld episode where Kramer discovers swimming in the East River is good for the body, and he feels better, yet he smells like a sewage pit. Well, swimming in the Thames River would be a problem. Franklin, beside that, was a night owl. Franklin was a night owl. He stay up half the night, but then he'd wake up late. That's kind of the way he worked. And whereas Adams, when they roomed together initially during the outbreak, after the war was on, and they both were diplomats, you'll find both of them complaining about each other's nighttime habits. Meaning, for Adams woke up early and woke Franklin up, and Franklin liked to stay up, and that kept Adams up. And maybe that was part of the reason they just never liked each other, because they were both very opinionated. Well, anyways, old Franklin, he'd get up later in the morning. Some of you are, late, night owls, just go to bed at 4 a.m. and wake up at 11 a.m. or noon or later, I guess. Anyways, Franklin would wake up and he'd walk into his toilet area, and no public bathroom at that point in time, and he'd take a bath every morning. But it's not the bath or the shower that you may take every time you wake up, but it is the bath of what he called an air bath. And he'd take a sponge, and he'd be naked as a jaybird. I think he slept in the buff. But he'd be naked as a jaybird, and he would just start wiping himself down with a dry bath. And that was his way of just getting his mind right and to start thinking about all those things he needed to do, and so on and so on. So, but Franklin had that as a facet. Obviously, his exercise routine, those sorts of things. He drank a little bit, but nothing. If I've ever read that he was never a drunken fella in life like some of the other characters you come across in American history. He never was that sort of way. But his family life was checkered, and that's probably being generous on my part. What had happened was his family life is that he's married and he marries his wife Deborah. And Deborah, I say marries, it's actually a common law marriage. And if you're not familiar with the term common law marriage, it's few states today still allow for common law marriages. Most of them outlawed it a long time ago. But under English common law, there was a type of marriage that was available to those who weren't really interested in a church marriage, a formal piece of parchment paper marriage. Texas today to this day, still has a common law marriage aspect. So what happens is that, let's say for argument's sake, you and your spouse really did not want to get married. You're like, I'm not going to get married in the church because we're not believers or observant or whatever. You know what? I don't really feel like going down to the courthouse and call Burleson County or Brazos County or Harris County or wherever you live in Texas, and you say, you got to go down there and go to the county clerk's office and go get a marriage license. So you're not really interested in that. And so basically what you do is, so in Texas, the way it works is you declare yourself a married couple. And you have about 2 or 3 ways to show it. You declare yourself a married couple. You present yourself to the public as a married couple. It'd be the equivalent of me and my wife Gloria. We were married in just a normal outdoor venue wedding sort of thing. So it's nothing unusual. Have the license. I think it's sitting on my desk over here or in a filing cabinet somewhere. Anyway, you're right. I don't exactly know where my marriage license is, but I know I'm married. So all of which is to say is I did it the traditional way. But if Gloria and I had decided to just get a common law marriage, we declare ourselves, and I'd announce her as, this is my wife Gloria Giesenschlag, and that's one thing. Secondly, you kind of have, at least financially would be one way to go about it, having say a joint checking account or something of that nature. You pool your financial resources, which is common as well. And then last but not least, and this is the one that kind of kicks in Texas, is that you and your wife, your spouse, are going, in my case, my wife, you and your spouse have a written agreement that you both sign. You just simply say, Nathan Giesenschlag, am married to Gloria Beth Quinn on this date here, I'm recording this on the 12th, 9/12/2020, for example. And you just both sign it and you put it in your filing cabinet, and that's that. Maybe you both have a copy. But anyways, that's a legitimate common law marriage in Texas. And so what it means is that if you were to get divorced, you'd have to go through a court system to be divorced. The state of Texas recognizes that as a marriage, a legal marriage, as if it was done by a justice of the peace or a priest. And so Deborah and Benjamin are going to be married in a common law fashion. They have some kids together, one of which is, oh, good gosh, oh, man, I just drew a blank on his name. So give me a second. I will pause this. All right, so William Franklin is the son, as I just looked this back up as I was thinking. I had that senior moment, I suppose. But anyways, William Franklin was a son, and he and Benjamin do not get along too well, especially during the Revolution. Benjamin Franklin could be a domineering character, and most of those historical figures often are. You see this in John Adams. You see it even in Jefferson, that it depends on what form it takes, but the domineering is that my way is the best way. I know what we should do. And in the case of Benjamin Franklin to his son William was a colonial governor in New Jersey. But basically is that William, I've thrown in with the American Revolution. I've thrown in with the Patriots, and you need to follow your father's lead. And William rebelled, and they basically never spoke again. Or let's say it this way, they spoke very little again. And but anyways, Franklin's relationship with his family was checkered. He, for all intents and purposes, abandons his wife on this side of the Atlantic Ocean for the better part of 20 years. Franklin, when he's in his late 40s, so make this about mid-40s, I guess you could say, about 17 about 1750 or so. No, 1752, thereabouts. Anyways, the date doesn't matter too much, but just understand this. Franklin is appointed Postmaster General of Pennsylvania to the Crown and to the court in London. And so that requires Franklin to go to London. In fact, I actually just happened to look this up. Kind of an interesting factoid is that Franklin is going to cross the Atlantic Ocean 8 times in his life. To be clear, in the 1700s, crossing the Atlantic Ocean was far safer than it had been in the 1500s or the 1600s, but I would not call it an easy journey. And sometimes you get out on the high seas, get caught up in the wrong storm, a hurricane, a norther, or whatever the case may be, it could kill you. Going across the Atlantic Ocean was normally a little faster than coming back, but all that to say is that it was at least a month-long journey, and sometimes crossing the Atlantic Ocean by ship from Boston or Philadelphia in the 1700s, it was even maybe a month and a half, 2-month journey if the winds were regularly against you. But you could do it, and it was potentially a deadly affair, though. Anyways, but Franklin goes and lives in London, basically from about 1752-54 all the way out to about 1774-5 for over almost 20 years exclusively. He makes a trip or two back in the meantime, but for the better part of 20 years, Benjamin Franklin essentially abandons his wife, Deborah. Doesn't leave her without money or home or whatever, but basically leaves his common-law wife and goes and lives the life of a celebrity in Europe. And the reason he's a celebrity is of all the great experiments that he does. And this is why you would say about Franklin that he was a child of the Enlightenment. It wasn't just that he was had his fingers in a lot of different pies, but he was also a scientific experimenter. Famously, of course, the kite, some say the kite experiment did not happen. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I think it did probably. But anyways, the kite experiment with electricity. And when we talk about electricity to this day, we still refer to electricity as currents, the currents of electricity. And that was Benjamin Franklin's contribution. Not only do you get that with Benjamin Franklin and that contribution there, you also see him create what is essentially a static electricity machine with a Leyden jar. And what it does is it produces, and this is before he goes to England, but it produces static electricity with conductors and condensers and generators, which are all phrases, by the way, of Franklin. Conductors, condensers, and generators. That's the English language getting influenced by Franklin. And he would ask his friends from time to time, he says, hey, I've been tinkering with this. Y'all want to try it out and check it out? And in one case, he was working that Leyden jar and he's spinning up the static electricity. And he said, put your hand on it, and they did this exposed wire, and they did, and it popped them just like, say, if it's dry times, especially in the wintertime, you built up static electricity and put your hand on that door, and it jumps. But this case, it doesn't just bite. It knocked them on their back. And Franklin laughed. They didn't. But anyways, that was Franklin, Dr. Franklin. And he publishes all this, and he talks about it, and he becomes a celebrity. He never gets a PhD formally. He never earns it in a strict sense. But for going forward for the rest of his life, he will be Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin. And he always, like I said earlier, he always believed himself to be a good Englishman. You'll actually see him when he's about 40 years old sit for a portrait to be painted, a very good portrait of him, but he's wearing an English wig. So, I mean, you're wearing an English wig, that means you want to be like the folks back home. But and he's like I said, a writer. One other thing to say is that he also produces what you can call in your notes an autobiography. How we know about his sowing of wild oats in London, he talked about it a little bit. Now, he was circumspect in how he says it, but anybody with eyes can understand and read between the lines rather easily that he was saying, I sowed wild oats while I was in London. And while he's in London the second time, that basically that 20-year gap between the 1750s and the outbreak of the American Revolution, when he comes back in a sense disgrace, at least in London-sized disgrace, he comes back and he'd carried on affairs. The man was not alone every night. So anyways, his family relationships were checkered, and he kept interesting friends. And so this allows me to transition after 43 minutes of talking about Franklin and the Enlightenment all the more. Let's talk a little bit now about the pushback against the Enlightenment, and that is the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is the one of about 2 or 3 major religious revivals in the United States or the future United States. The Great Awakening, as far as we're concerned, basically runs from roughly the year 1730 to about 1740. It's not a constant revival. It's not a regular thing that happens all over the place at the same time. But what you see with the Great Awakening is the crackle and pop of old-time religion, in a sense responding to, as it were, the threat of the Enlightenment. One of the things, as I opened this lecture up with, is the discussion of materialism and materialism's threat of bleakness and corrosiveness and scouring of optimism at all. In the materialism that is so here and now and so fleshy, as it were, material like I'm knocking on this desk I'm sitting at while I'm lecturing, it plays out and it pushes aside and shoves aside the spiritual aspects of humanity. And especially that for a revealed religion like Christianity, because that's who we're predominantly worried about or talking about here, it would be a major complaint. And if you actually read another character, a philosopher, a political philosopher from that time period, a guy named Thomas Hobbes, his seminal work is called Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes is a materialist of the first order, and he is a bleak and dreary materialist. So the pushback is going to be that no, not everything is material. There is a spiritual aspect to life, and it is not everything that can be answered can be answered simply through observation, reason, and science. There is revelation. There is mystery out there, as it were, and it's not bleak and dreary. There is hope. And so you see with this Great Awakening a revival of religion. And again, as I said previously to you, not everybody who becomes a child of the Enlightenment ditches basically, or rather Orthodox Christianity, small o, which means the major tenets of Christianity, divinity of Jesus, virgin birth, and so on. No, not everybody who becomes a child of the Enlightenment in the sense that they are interested in science ditches the revealed religion. In fact, most people, again, who are living in the 1720s, 30s, 10s, whatever, but during the Enlightenment, most rank and file Americans are themselves Christian to one degree or another. But you really see in this sense a rebirth of religion, because even if they were Christian to one degree or another, as I said a minute ago, you had, and I have said this in the end of the Puritan lecture, you saw the burning over, especially in Massachusetts and New England, but you found it elsewhere in the Quaker Pennsylvania and places. You kind of saw a burning over of religion that was declined and had declined. And what had happened was, as I indicated with that Puritan lecture, that human nature had kind of set in, and that there had been a watering down and a breaking down of, in the case of Massachusetts and New England, a breaking down of old-time Puritanism, which is Calvinistic in its nature, in its essence. And it was broken down, and what you ended up finding by the year 1700 and certainly 1720 and even 1730, you will find a lot of preachers not preaching old-time gospel, old-time religion, as it were. I'm kind of playing off of some phrases you may have heard, a few of you, over the years. But you will see them preaching and teaching a kind of a deism, the term, modern term, this is a 2020 I'm recording, moral therapeutic deism. And what I mean by that is not literally a deist replacement of Christianity, but they take the tenets of deism, which is be good to your neighbor, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's essentially, by the way, what Franklin lived by. He was a deist to some form or fashion. It frankly depends on what day of the week and what year you catch Franklin onto what he exactly believes with regard to God. The thing is that the idea of living by the virtues and doing good unto your others and being just, that is a lot of what was being preached in the early 1700s. It was unsatisfying to many, and it was just it was okay, but it just was not really true Christianity. And so what it took was you have a series of events take place in the introduction of a lot of different preachers, but one of which I would say you need to put in your notes here, who's going to be very much a face of the Enlightenment, face of the Great Awakening, which was by far much bigger than deism ever was, or even much bigger as far as just raw numbers, the Great Awakening and who it touched and how far it went, than the Enlightenment in a sense ever was. So the Enlightenment's important, don't get me wrong. I think it's extraordinarily important. I've spent the better part of an hour and a half or more over two parts of two lectures discussing this. I think it's very important, but the Great Awakening, raw numbers, impacted more people. So the Great Awakening is going to be really two names that we talk about, and you can do books on this. You can discuss this ad nauseum, but I won't. But two names that you need to be aware of. One of which is an Englishman who comes to North America a whole lot, and he was Church of England, but he was really a Calvinist and but a preacher of the first order. That man's name is George Whitefield. It's spelled Whitefield with a White and then field, but it's Whitfield pronounced. George Whitefield is one of the great preachers in American religious history. And George Whitefield is nothing to behold. He was not a pretty boy like a Joel Osteen. I'm sorry to say it like that, but I do like to have my fun with at the expense of Joel Osteen. And Osteen's like 55 or something now. But anyways, Joel Osteen, if you ever look at him, you can tell he's obviously kept in great shape. By that I mean workout, personal trainer sort of thing. Probably looks like his face has had some work done on it as well. I'm being catty, frankly, I guess at this point. But I am saying is that Whitefield is nothing like that. He doesn't come across as a pretty boy preacher. He's not a celebrity on TV, but yet Whitefield is a celebrity. It is estimated that in Whitefield's life, he is going to preach at least 18,000 times and at least to 10 million people within England, Great Britain, and the future United States. And to look at him, he's nothing impressive. He's short. He's like 5'4" or so. And he is horribly cross-eyed. Every picture that is honest, and most of them, frankly, are, is that every picture that is honest, that is portrait, I say taken, but it's painted of him, shows him with that left eye, as I guess is my left, it would be pointing over this direction here. He was horribly cross-eyed, badly cross-eyed. But yet that little man had a set of lungs on him. He had a voice on him that just could carry beyond, and beyond to the furthest reaches of crowds. And that was part of the reason he was so impactful, because he had such a booming and attractive voice. In addition to that, Whitefield preached in the churches and outside of the churches. Because what Whitefield is preaching is essentially like John the Baptist in the New Testament, if you're familiar with John the Baptist's preaching, which is repentance, return to the Lord, and seek forgiveness. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic outline of it. And Whitefield's an Anglican, but yet he acts like he is a Presbyterian Calvinist. And so he's stirring the pot. He comes to North America. He is going to preach in Philadelphia. He'll preach in Boston, New York. He preaches up and down the colonies. And before it's all said and done, he is going to be one of Benjamin Franklin's greatest friends. Those two were famously friendly. And, Franklin, the first time Franklin goes to see Whitefield preach, and I believe it was, if I've got this written down in my notes, I believe it was about 1735 or so. The exact date does not matter, but when Whitefield comes to Philadelphia for the first time, Franklin goes to see this man and wants to hear him preach. And Franklin, who was a tinkerer and experimenter already, was experimenting with sound waves and how do they work and that sort of thing. And so what Franklin did at least the first sermon, and probably others as well, is that Franklin started up basically at the front of the crowd. And so that just like me in front of this microphone, let me see if I can make this work. I better not. Anyways, all that to say is, because I just don't think it's better not do this, but, just as I'm leaning into this microphone right now and I got a whole lot louder, as I step back and start to pull away, I'm not changing the tone of my voice that I can tell, yet I can see out of the corner of my eye the monitor talking about or showing how little or how much less I'm making an impact. And so I'm backing away, and you can still hear it, but at the same time, I am changing as far as the nearness of my voice. Anyways, Franklin was doing experiments to see how that would affect and so forth. And Franklin starts to back away from Whitefield, and he's making notes in the crowd and so forth. And Whitefield is going to preach to more people at any one time and speak to regardless of preaching, but speak to more people at any one time than anybody else in American history up until the American Revolution. He drew folks in left and right. Some were believers and some were scoffers, but he drew a lot of folks in. But anyways, he was good at it. He had drama, he had anecdote, he had rhetoric. There we mixed in a little bit of evidently imperial pride. I'm proud to be a Briton. It's kind of an old trick. but at the same time, it was old-time religion, and not everybody appreciated his excitement or his enthusiasm. People like George Whitefield were extremely controversial in religious circles in England and in North America. Oh, by the way, Franklin never converted, and Whitefield tried. Oh, he tried. Those two were best friends, but they are very good friends anyways. Best friend might be a stretch, but certainly very good friends. And Whitefield will try all of his life to convert Franklin to Christianity in a formal, get baptized sort of way. And Franklin, who could kind of brush it off as if he decided he didn't want to go any further on the subject, he'd start telling jokes and change the subject and kind of laugh stuff off. He did that to his sister late in life on a subject that's out there. It was a religion, actually, is what do you believe? And Franklin starts into it, and then he just kind of laughs it off and moves on. That was the way Franklin worked. But those two were very good friends, and even though Franklin was a skeptic of revealed religion, like most deists are, it was also Franklin who was wealthy and had a lot of money in his pockets one day that when the collection plate came by to help fund actually an orphanage in Georgia, you'll see Franklin dumping his money into the collection plate and probably giving the equivalent of thousands of dollars in one movement in modern sense. But the thing about Whitefield is that he is going to upset the apple cart, the old, staid, and true apple cart. What happens is that a lot of the old religious establishments, whether they were Presbyterian or Congregational or Anglican, they were very suspicious of people who got into the Spirit. They were very suspicious, when I say get into the Spirit, those who are moved and perhaps shriek during a revival meeting, and those who are very emotional in their movement, who feel a conversion experience. If you come from a church background, you may be noticing I'm using some phrases that sound an awful lot like a Baptist because that's kind of what you're getting here. Whitefield, to be clear, is no Baptist, but at the same time, there's a lot of borrowing, syncretism, I guess is the right word, that you might recognize in a more modern sense. But a lot of the old Presbyterians, the old lights and the old ways, as they were called, they were suspicious and downright distrustful of people like Whitefield. They basically thought all this revivalism was not true religion. It was just a flash in the pan, and it really wasn't a true change of heart. And so that's going to cause a lot of consternation. I always say this about Whitefield, and he preaches more than just the basics of a sermon, but at the same time, that's his bread and butter. But I always say this about Whitefield, a couple things. One, you didn't mess with him. One story, I believe it was on the initial trip to North America in the 1730s when the awakening is really getting going in the north, in Massachusetts and elsewhere. This one old sailor, crusty and cruel, old, and he'd been on the high seas for years, and he was no Christian. He made it pretty plain that he wasn't, and he knew that Whitefield, who was already a celebrity when he was coming to North America, he knew that Whitefield was on that boat, and he sought Whitefield out, and he started to mock him and make fun of him and ridicule faith and all that business. Somewhere on the high seas, a storm blew up, and high seas meaning the North Atlantic. A storm blew up. It was some question whether the boat would sink or not, but it did not. And after the storm passed, they did an inventory and a check on everybody who was there, and everybody survived the storm except for that old crusty sailor who had mocked the preacher. Now, I don't know whether everybody became Christian that day or what exactly happened, but I do know this, is that nobody messed with Whitefield on that trip for the rest of the way across the ocean, because if you don't know this, many people are superstitious that the man who picked on the holy man, the man who picked on the divine, was tossed over the side of the boat during a storm. And they took that as divine retribution for picking on a godly man. Anyways, so that would be one story. The second one, more importantly, though, is this, is that for all that's out there, you know as well as I do, some of these folks who are prominent religious people. At the time of this recording, Jerry Falwell Jr. comes to mind, though he's not actually a preacher. There are more than a few preachers over the years prominently who have either maybe not been corrupt, but certainly have lived high on the hog, Joel Osteen, and others who who are corrupt, whether it's they steal money and put their hand into the till, meaning they into the treasury of the church, and they start lining their pockets with it. It depends on how you do it. They love the money. That's what they were there for, to get rich. And then you have other preachers who take advantage of their celebrity status. Even if it's not a national celebrity, it's just a celebrity status in the community or in the church. And they take advantage of people sexually and do that. You see this in lots of different denominations. We don't need to recount every jot and tittle and every example that is out there. But they're false prophets, to use a phrase. The thing is that I've always respected Whitefield because he collected a whole lot of money in his lifetime, and he paid his expenses without padding those expenses. And what he also did was, when he collected that money, like when Franklin dumped his pockets into the plate, what Whitefield was supporting was an orphanage in Georgia. Georgia was a recently established colony in the early 1700s, and Whitefield is establishing an orphanage in Georgia, which was designed to help those kids who needed it. I've always respected him for that. But anyways, all of which is to say is that Whitefield was never a... I've lectured twice today, I guess. Whitefield was never a man who enriched himself nor took advantage of his celebrity and had girlfriends or boyfriends or anything of the sort. I've always respected that about him. May not agree with everything he preaches or teaches, but he is an important character. In American theology and the Great Awakening, the second name you need to note here, Whitefield, remember, is an Englishman. The second individual is an American, and that man is probably the greatest theologian ever produced by the United States of America, and his name is Jonathan Edwards. And sadly, when you think of Jonathan Edwards, all you get from Jonathan Edwards in even modern scholarship in modern books is Jonathan Edwards gave a sermon once and it scared people half to death. Jonathan Edwards was actually never as good of a scholar, never as good of a speaker as Whitefield. Whitefield had that ability with that booming voice and the right cadence and so forth to paint a beautiful word picture that could motivate or move his audience, or the spirit, depends on how you see these things, I guess, to move an audience to this or that. Where Edwards was really good is his writing. And Edwards is going to write a bunch of treatises in theology, some of them dense, some of them not. But at the same time, Edwards is an old-line Calvinist, but he's going to use some of the Enlightenment tools in observation and so forth to bolster the call of the old-time religion. The freedom of the will is probably Edwards' greatest theological treatment, but when you talk about Edwards, and just for a brief moment here, we need to mention him because he is so very important, because you find his fingerprints everywhere in the Great Awakening and even afterwards. To this day, people still read him. But Edwards his sermons are pretty good too, in the sense that they're written down and you still have them. Everyone who remembers Edwards remembers him for Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And perhaps as a junior in high school, you had to read an American literature. I went to a high school that split goodly. That's not a great word. But thankfully, they split American literature away from American English in the sense that grammar. And so I got American literature, and I'm really glad they did. That's really the way it should be done. But anyways, all of which is to say is that they split it. And Edwards, I got Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And I read that sermon. It's an example of the hellfire brimstone type preaching you can get. It's the first time it was given by Edwards. He didn't finish it. It was so evocative, and it was so good that day that people went screaming out of the church in pandemonium. But he will give it again, and he will finish it. The loathsome spider, you were like a loathsome spider, and only God has to do is turn his hand and you would fall in, and so forth. It's a very evocative hellfire brimstone sort of sermon. Yet at the same time, one of his other great sermons is the 180 degrees the opposite. It is called Heaven is a World of Love, and if you ever look it up, Control F, you look at it and you find the word love just sprinkled also liberally through it. But Edwards, is going to be a giant in the Great Awakening for his preaching, for his writings, for his theology, and last but not least, his impact upon the colleges. By the way, and I'll finish with the colleges today in the Great Awakening. And a lot of people will come to the Great Awakening and refire their religious fervency to some degree because of it. But the thing about Edwards and people like Edwards and even Whitefield to a degree is that they have a definite shelf life. They don't always aren't always received or respected throughout their career or their lifetime. When it comes to Edwards, he will be fired from several pastorates because they'd gotten tired of him. The congregation in Massachusetts or Connecticut got tired of him. At the end of his life, he was a president of Yale University or Yale College. And Yale College or Yale University was a recent development. We'll talk about that in just a second. But in the last lecture, I talked about the smallpox inoculation. And Edwards, like Cotton Mather before him, Edwards knew and read science. He read a lot of other things besides just religion. And he was encouraging his parishioners, he was encouraging his students to get inoculated for smallpox. And he said, I'll show you. I'll do it myself. The problem was that Edwards' health was bad. And as I said in the last lecture, that was the people that should not take that crude inoculation of the cut on the arm. And so Edwards did it, and it killed him. And so Edwards is gone when he's in his mid-50s. But a lot of folks died in their mid-50s anyways because of just the miles on the body. But if you wanted to say what was the legacy of the Great Awakening and why do we spend time talking about it beyond the fact that it was people went and heard people preach and all that sort of business, it has to do with several facets. Number one, you see the splitting of churches, and there's an independency aspect now moving beyond religion. There's an independent mindset of we can do with our churches as we see fit. We are going to break away and set up our own denomination. So this idea of splitting and independence, that's there. Secondly, you'll also see, as one of my colleagues says, you know what, they put a heavy, these Great Awakening preachers, beyond the two that I mentioned, put a heavy emphasis on the priesthood of the believer, which that's a Baptist term, which basically means you do not need any intermediary, but the independence of the believer in his relationship with God, that almost goes so far as to say, but it goes close to saying you don't need a church. It doesn't, but it's close. So there's an independence-minded and individual aspect to it as well. And the other third, and this is beyond the foreshadowing of the coming of the American Revolution sort of stuff with those aspects of independency, independent practice, habits of self-governance, and so forth. The thing, too, to remember about the Great Awakening is that it also has the legacy, and it's a big legacy. It's probably the biggest legacy it has to the present time. Probably is, actually. The biggest legacy it has is in the form of colleges and universities. Prior to the Civil War, so this is a 1301 subject, prior to the Civil War, colleges and universities were established by churches or denominations or the church. Depends on who you're talking about, depends on who established it. Now, do they always stay true to the church model that created them? No. That's just a fact of life. After the Civil War, especially after, say, about 1880, you will see lots and lots of universities and colleges established not by the church anymore, but by wealthy benefactors. Leland Stanford is an example, Stanford University, amongst many. But before the Civil War, where we are, the great beginnings of the Ivy Leagues, the great schools that we think of as the Ivy Leagues, were established by the people who were, by the revitalization of religion, revitalization of Protestantism and different denominations because of the Great Awakening. Harvard was well established before the Great Awakening. That is clear. That is true. And that was, Harvard was, by the way, established by the Puritans to be an incubator of Puritan ministers. In the 1600s, it becomes clear in the eyes of many Puritans, especially the late 1600s, that Harvard had gone away, had fallen away, and had become almost apostate. So if you want good Puritan ministers, well, then you need to send them elsewhere. You need to have those ministers trained up in other places. And that created the establishment of Yale College, or Yale University, as we know it in New Haven, Connecticut. That was established in, I think, about 1701. I'm looking down at a note right here. 1636 is really when you could say the apostasy of Yale, or Harvard, excuse me, but 1701, Yale is established. Elihu Yale is the namesake of Yale University. Anyways, Yale University was supposed to be the correction against Harvard's apostasy, and this you're going to have real good preaching and teaching being taught to the young ministers in training there at Yale. As I said just a minute ago, Edwards is going to be one of the early presidents of Yale University. Anyways, but that is not, neither one of those two are literally or actually children of the Great Awakening, but these next ones are. First in your list here, established in 1746, is Princeton University. Please put that in your notes. Princeton University, 1746. That is a Presbyterian college. Princeton is in New Jersey, and it's one of the great Ivy League schools to this day, and still has a fairly, somewhat respected anyways, depends on what circles you come from, Presbyterian school attached to it. Another school that is established by a college and is endowed by some wealthy individuals is Brown University in Rhode Island. Brown University, which is one of the most, all the Ivy Leagues are progressive to some degree or another, Brown over the years has been considered the most progressive, and that's a modern development. But in its earliest days, Brown was a Baptist university established in 1765 and going forward. Rutgers University in New Jersey, which is really now kind of a public institution, was established by the Dutch Reformed in the late 1700s. In fact, 1770. The same can be said as Dartmouth, which was also established as a church school in Massachusetts in 1770. So you've got all these Ivy Leagues or schools that are very close to the Ivy Leagues as well. Penn University in Philadelphia and Columbia University in New York City. Penn was established first by by Whitefield as a religious academy, but they slipped the leash and quickly became a religious but not overly enthusiastic school. But it has its foundings in the Great Awakening, at least indirectly, and the same can be said for King's College, which is Columbia University in New York City. It was established by the Anglicans to tamp down on the enthusiasm of the Great Awakening or leftover remnant of it, and oh, by the way, also to help out and help train new ministers to turn Presbyterians into good Anglicans and that sort of thing. William and Mary in Virginia is also one of the colleges that will be established in the colonial period, but it is not a Great Awakening. William and Mary is in Williamsburg, Virginia. So, anyways, all those are legacies. Those are big legacies, and almost all of them, to some degree or another, are established by the church. And so, if you were to ask me what maybe the greatest legacy of the Awakening is, it might just be in the Ivy Leagues. So that's a good place to stop at an hour and 11 minutes. Boy, I keep talking and talking. We'll see you.